Hey, welcome everyone to our Hope Connect session, from crime and punishment to compassion and evidence-based. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, let us take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to care for the lands and to strengthen relationships between nations, to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous people and unique histories, homelands, languages, cultural practices, and spiritual beliefs, and how we can move forward together in a respectful and meaningful spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I'd like to introduce Susie, who will open us with a prayer. Susie is our Mum Stop the Harm Indigenous liaison person. Welcome, Susie.
Good morning and thank you. So I'll start with some words in Cree. Kasemantu, ginanas kamitanan nanos kagisiga. Sawan minan kamino bamatia. Wichihinan kanwenaminan. Anos wawake mata tigisigaw. Wichihinan kanwenaminan. Kakanoninanan gitwas masa. Napewak, squawak. Squesisak, ewa napesisak. Minanan and nasawin, ego minomachi hoen. We want to acknowledge and give thanks. We want to acknowledge the ancestral territory of the nations that were and are here on these lands. We want to acknowledge the 600 plus nations that were here on these lands prior to contact. Who were and are unique and distinct societies, their own languages and systems of governance, who saw themselves as a part of creation and saw creation as divine revelation that inspired them, strengthened them, and helped them to live with each other and to take care of each other and the land. They knew the waters, the skies, the patterns of the weather, the animals. So we look to the east, to the south, the west, and the north, and we acknowledge the ancestral story, truth, and wisdom of all the Indigenous nations. We think about how the story unfolded over time and how today we have many nations that call this place home now. Those who came as guests, visitors, settlers, refugees, immigrants, newcomers. And we are mindful of each one of our stories, our journey, our memories, experiences of our own individual lives, and how our stories connect to the Indigenous worldview story that was happening here prior to contact. And we think about a win-win situation where we are each honored and we all participate going forward in a good way. And so we give thanks for this day, for this time, for our learning that we will do today and our unlearning, and the hope that all this will bring for healing and wellness for all. And so I say, Igusane nananaskaman, gahkinonawakamagana. Thank you. I am grateful. All my relations. Thank you. Igusane.
Thank you, Susie. A beautiful way to start our day today and this session. So we just thank you for your words and your heart that you bring to this. Thank you. And next we'd like to introduce Tyla Savard, who's our Acting Director of Operations and Stronger Together Canada Program Manager. Tyla.
Well, happy Saturday, everyone. It is so awesome to see so many people here today. Just wonderful. It warms my heart every time that we can all get together to be able to connect and learn and just be able to take that knowledge back into our communities. Even if it's only our immediate families that it goes back into, we know that it's still valuable and has that ripple effect. So it is awesome to see everyone on such a, I would say it's a beautiful day where I am, but I know at the same time, Alberta is pretty much a lot of fires right now. So, if you have some rain, please definitely send it our way. We could use that sharing as well. I just wanted to, oops, sorry, I have a little visitor on my shoulder there. So I just wanted to bring greetings from behalf of, all of our staff who work hard on our team of Stronger Together, not only our Canada team, but as well as our BC team. They work tirelessly to, connect with each of our volunteers who come on as facilitators, and we work hard to be able to make such events as today happen with our learning opportunities, of which we call our Hope and Heart Connects, as well as various conferences and such. So our team is definitely hardworking, very dedicated to the subject of what brings us all together, and always looking for opportunities and speakers and such. So definitely, please don't hesitate ever to, make suggestions, give your feedback and such. We'd love to be able to hear from you to be able to grow our programming. We have some funding. The only reason why we identified as two different teams is just because of some of our funding. So BC was able to give us some provincial funding. The year before, we got some federal funding. So, but at the end of the day, we are all still just stronger together. It's an overall team that work hard together to make things happen. We have a couple of our board members on as well, so which was wonderful to see. So I'll definitely extend greetings from our board on behalf of them. I know that that's another definitely hardworking team that's within Mom Stop the Harm, and collectively together, we make it all happen. At the same time, if it wasn't for you being, attending such sessions as today and just reaching out to connect, we wouldn't be the force that we are. And as much as we're called moms, it's really everyone. It's only moms because those were our founding members that gave us that name because of their role in their experience. But at the same time, it's important that we're all here. Everyone is always more than welcome. And like I said, or Antoinette said, sorry, to check out our not only our websites, but as well as the our YouTube channel. We have lots of different resources and such on all of that. So definitely, and also has our contact information. So definitely don't hesitate, reach out anytime. Feel free to please share. The more that we can, educate and raise awareness, the stronger that we can come together as well. So thanks again for joining us today. And thanks for the opportunity to be able to, to work on this subject together to make things better for all of us in this crazy journey that we go through.
Thank you, Tyler. So I'm just going to do a really quick review of our process today, and then I will hand it over to Ben. So today's format, as you can see, we're in a webinar, and I've let people know that we won't see your pictures, but your names do appear on this side screen. We'll have Ben present for about 45 minutes ish, and then we will start opening it up for questions. So please, at the bottom of your screen, I think it's the same for everybody, there's a Q&A box, so please put your questions in there. And there's also a chat. Tyler's going to help monitor the chat, and so sometimes people kind of get it mixed up, so we'll move some of those questions into the Q&A box. So
Antoinette, just so that you're aware, the chat has been disabled. So everyone is communicating through the Q&A. So if you cannot put anything into chat, in case we're able to update that, then just know that please definitely put your comments and questions into the Q&A, and we'll still make sure that it's relayed.
Okay, because I thought I had enabled the chat. No? Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you for that. So again, I guess, so thanks for the correction, Tyler. So we'll put your questions into the Q&A box. So without any further ado, so I'm really pleased and honored to be able to introduce Benjamin Perrin, who is a professor at the University of British Columbia Peter A. Allard School of Law. He served as a law clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada and was the lead justice and public safety advisor to Prime Minister Stephen Harper from 2012 to 2013. Professor Perrin has also authored, now in this one I think it says 2, but I think that's wrong, maybe 3 books, and you can talk about that in a bit. One of them being Invisible Chains, Canada's Underground World of Human Trafficking, which was a national bestseller and named one of the top books of the year by Globe and Mail and Victim Law, the Law of Victims of Crime. He lives in BC. Benjamin has also written Overdose, Heartbreak and Hope in Canada's Opioid Crisis, which has a foreword supported by Gabor Mate, and that foreword states, overdose is a necessary and searching investigation into a devastating epidemic that should never have happened. Benjamin painstakingly shows that it need not continue if we as a society heed the evidence. His latest book is being launched this year, Indictment, the Criminal Justice System on Trial. Benjamin has taken the time to research and explore from the ground what's taking place in Canada today, and brings not only wisdom, but also a heartfelt and compassionate lens. So join me in welcoming Benjamin Perrin. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Antoinette, and also Tyler, Susie, and yeah, everyone who's joining us online. It's really an honor to be here today. My first knowledge of Mom Stop the Harm was when I was trying to learn about this toxic contaminated drug crisis back in 2018 or so, when I began researching this, and I very quickly came across your organization, and I was like, I have to talk to these folks. Like, who better to educate me? As Susie said a few minutes ago, we need to both learn and unlearn, and I had a lot of unlearning to do. And I approached this issue by putting what I thought I knew about substance use, about drugs aside. And I said, I've got to go and talk to people who know firsthand. And one of the people that I interviewed for my book Overdose, and is featured, prominently throughout that book, as those of you who've read it will know, is Leslie McBain. And so, yeah, I just want to acknowledge your ongoing work with her to support each other, to be a strong voice advocating, and to do things like this, just continue to learn. And we're all still learning. Most of all, put myself at the top of that list. So the other thing with Overdose is we've been really happy to actually support Mom Stop the Harm as one of the organizations that's been able to receive some of the author royalties. And so we've been happy to continue to do that. And it's really been great to see the organization continue to grow and all that. So yeah, so it's a real honor. So I feel like I'm among friends, even though I don't know all of you in the call, or maybe most of you, but it's great to be here today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. I've got some slides I'll walk through, and then during the Q&A, we can have a bit more of a chat or discussion. So I want to start by acknowledging a couple of things. First of all, yeah, where I'm coming from here in Vancouver, my home in East Vancouver is in the traditional ancestral and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. My research, as you'll know if you've had a chance to read Overdose, heavily not only looks at the impact of the toxic contaminated drug crisis on Indigenous peoples, but it also profiles their resilience, and also the really different, I would say, and quite frankly, more advanced ideas that I saw, from example, from the First Nations Health Authority on how we should be dealing with the crisis. In comparison with some of the Western scientific model of how you deal with the problem. And so if you've had a chance to look at Overdose, kind of a bit more about that, but essentially a much more holistic approach. And that's something that I'm a huge advocate of as well. So I want to acknowledge that. The other thing I want to acknowledge is this is not some generic policy issue. Okay, we're not here debating whether we should have plastic bags in grocery stores, right? This isn't about whether there should be a bike lane in your community. There's heated debates about those issues, as you well know. This is a very different issue for a number of reasons. The foremost, and particularly for those of you who are here today, is this is an issue which is profoundly and in some cases devastatingly impacted your life. People have undoubtedly, I'd imagine everyone here has lost a loved one or a friend, someone close to you, someone very close to you, in some cases more than one or even many people. So we have to approach this very differently. And so I just want to begin by acknowledging that, because at some points I may slip into my kind of, let's analyze the policy and the law. That'll happen. I'm a law professor. So, but before I do that, I do want to acknowledge that it's not just a generic public policy issue at all. The other reason it's quite different is there is no other issue right now in Canada where the need is greater, the stakes are higher in terms of people's health, well-being, and their lives being impacted than by this toxic contaminated drug crisis. And so we need to be talking about it. We need to be talking about a lot more, and we need to find different and better ways to share and communicate about the title of the talk today, which is moving away from crime and punishment to compassion and evidence-based approaches. And I also want to acknowledge too, folks who are here who themselves are maybe have lived experience with substances or in recovery at different stages of that journey, and just to acknowledge that. And also those of you who are supporting family members, maybe struggling to support family members who have substance use disorders. I didn't share about it in Overdose. I didn't have permission to do that, but I will be it's quite a significant part of my next book, Indictment, which you heard about a minute ago, is coming out in the fall. The book actually starts talking about my father-in-law's addiction to crack cocaine and how that played out in the criminal justice system. So I have his permission and the family's permission to share that. So that's why that's going to be coming out, fall, and didn't come out before. Certainly nothing to hide. But I think part of this is about having more openness and more discussions and being able to take away the shame and the stigma that comes with all the baggage that we have around substance use. So before I get into the talk, there's just one more kind of additional thing. I did want to mention, it would be fairly obvious to most people, but we're obviously talking about substance use. I am going to be talking as well a little bit about childhood trauma, but not in any graphic terms. Certainly no specific instances of abuse are going to be talked about, but I will be talking in generic terms about childhood trauma, in particular its links to substance use and addiction, as well incarceration, and obviously, as I've already alluded to, we'll be referring to overdose deaths in the workshop as well. Also, for those of you who are Indigenous, there'll be some references to the residential school system and the ongoing impacts of the various forms of colonization that are still occurring. And so we want to make sure people feel safe. As you heard a minute ago, this talk's being recorded. So if you need to take a break, please do. You can come back and listen to the recording when you feel ready to do that and prepared to do that. I'm also going to post some just resources in the chat. So if you do need, before, during, or after to take a break and access some of those resources, please do. We've got to be look after ourselves before we can begin to kind of support others in that, right? So, all right. So with that said, the title of the talk, I would just want to briefly sort of set the stage for us, and then we're going to get right into it. So crime and punishment has been the predominant mindset or paradigm for how we view, I'll say, drugs in a specific sense. So caffeine is a drug, yes, alcohol and tobacco are drugs. We're going to talk about those actually in a bit of detail in a moment. But when I talk about drugs, I'm mainly going to be referring to substances which are criminalized, okay? So we're talking about things like heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, methamphetamine, MDMA, ecstasy, things that I didn't know, I knew nothing about before starting this research. So other than that, in generic terms. So our approach as a society in Canada, at least for well over a century, has been that of crime and punishment. These things are bad, they need to be criminalized, and people who use these substances, who possess them, who have anything to really do with them, selling them, borrowing, trading them, that should be illegal. People should go to prison for that. They should be punished. The other context to that is not just the legal piece, it's also the sort of moral piece, that this was viewed as and continues to be by many people. We're in a bit of a transition, but again, we're going to talk about, is the pendulum swinging back now a bit from this approach? It's not certain that it's all going in the same direction towards a more progressive approach, that's for sure. That there's also been a tremendous amount of moral judgment on people for using substances. It was seen as a moral failure. The other thing I remember, of course, I'm in my mid-40s. I remember growing up in the 80s, seeing the Just Say No campaign, the DARE campaign, Dare to Say No to Drugs. As I talk about in my book, those campaigns actually backfired, and there's evidence that they actually increased at least for some youth, their decision to start using drugs or try drugs out. And really strong messaging. We also had in the, starting in the 70s and accelerating through the 80s, 90s, and even to today, the war on drugs. So putting billions upon billions of dollars in Canada and globally into trying to crack down on the supply of drugs and then also crack down on the demand for drugs, and that's how we would go about doing it. So this mentality and the stigma and shame that go with substance use is deeply rooted in our society. Okay, so we need to start out by understanding that. When studies are done of stigma is a word which refers to social opprobrium, vitriol, hatred. And they ask people, the World Health Organization did a survey of, it was over a dozen countries, including Canada. And they said, who do you have the highest level of stigma for? And it listed a whole bunch of different people. There's politicians on the list, and people who've committed crimes are on the list. People with leprosy were on the list, if you can believe it, because it was an international study. They asked about that apparently, and they asked about people who use drugs. And the group of people who had the highest level of stigma in that study was people who use drugs, even higher than people with leprosy. So the baggage that we have is huge. I have a really small rustic cabin here on the BC coast. It was a shack. It's no running water, no electricity. It's got those things now, but it was and still is pretty much a shack. It's also got a problem with weeds. We love this place, okay, but it's got a problem. And it's those kind of weeds that if you pull them up, they go underground and find somewhere else. And the more you dig out and find more, first you get to a root that's maybe the size of your pinky finger, and then you get to one that's the size of your thumb. The next thing you know, you're pulling out these huge clumps. And the more you pull and dig, there's just more. It's everywhere. That's how I think about the entrenchment of societal views and perceptions about substances. It is deep rooted. It is hard to pull out. And what we see on the surface is just the tip of the iceberg, as it were. It's just those little weed leaves popping up. And so there's a ton of work we need to do to unpack and understand and explore as a society, but also for ourselves, what our views are, what are our stereotypes, what are our prejudices. Even just if you were to say to someone, now this group is obviously going to be very different, but if you say to a sort of generic member of the public who maybe isn't directly touched by this issue, you say, why don't you think of your mind of someone who uses drugs? What's going to come to mind, right? It's going to probably be someone who is a homeless person who is using drugs on the street. Maybe they think of somewhere like the downtown east side, or whichever city you happen to be from, the area of town where open drug use would maybe be seen, right? So there's already a lot of additional things that are going to be coming with that. Well, in fact, we know that that's not the case. We know that obviously substance users are throughout society at all different socioeconomic levels and from all different kinds of backgrounds. So that's the shift that we're going to be talking about today. So the starting point is this crime and punishment mentality that we have had, and it's been the way we've approached it. We're going to prohibit the substances. We're going to crack down. It's wrong. We're going to punish you. What I'm trying to do in my work and through the research, what brought me to this place is that we need to move from that crime and punishment to this new place of compassion and understanding and evidence-based approaches. We need to do things that are going to work to help. And so that's the kind of shift that we want to go through. And I'll talk more about what that means in some detail later on. So how did we get to where we are? One of the things I was asked to do at a talk in the fall was I was asked by a group of it was the Addictions Medicine Conference in Saskatchewan. They said they wanted me to give a talk about, because I didn't work in government, said, we'd like to hear about the policy criteria around which substances are criminalized and which aren't. And so I started out the talk with that. And I think it's a good place to start because it makes a really compelling point. And that is that our drug policies and our drug laws are not evidence-based. That's why I'm saying we need to shift towards evidence-based. So let's give a really concrete example. Here are 3 actual substances. For now, I'm calling them substance 1, substance 2, and substance 3. And I'll go through the detail on the slide with you here. This is the most recent data we have on this stuff. And it's from the Canadian Center on Substance Use and Addiction. So it's a little bit outdated, particularly in the context of the acceleration of the toxic drug crisis, but I still think it stands pretty well up to what we want to talk about, which is even at that point in time, why were these substances criminalized or why weren't they? So substance 1, $16.6 billion in annual cost to society. So this includes like healthcare, criminal justice expenses, social services, all that kind of stuff. It's the highest of the 3. So if you look across the the three tables here, it's the highest at 16.6. Substance 2 is actually the lowest. It's 5.9 billion. And right in the middle is substance 3, $12.3 billion. Okay, so substance 1 is the most costly to society. Next, we look at the second bullet is criminal justice involvement. Substance number 1, 30% of criminal justice costs are attributed to the use of this substance. So that means calls to police to respond to issues are at least 30% of those costs are going here. People who committed offenses while under the influence of this substance and then were incarcerated, maybe not even for using that substance, because some of these are legal, we're going to find out, but their crime was committed while under the influence of that. And another one would be examples if they're on probation or parole and they have a condition that they not use the substance, which is still really common. Even if you're addicted to something, they tell you not to use it. And if you do, threaten to go back to jail. Okay, so all those costs of criminal justice, almost a third of our criminal justice expenditures are attributable to substance 1. Substance 2, much less, about 10%, and substance 3, hardly any, okay, 0.1, so not a negligible amount. Then the next metric we look at, we think, maybe something like the proportion of people who died in any given year. For substance 1, at the time of these statistics, was around 18,000 deaths were attributable to this substance in Canada. Substance 2, about 5,000. And look at this, substance 3, by far and away the highest in terms of the death rate at almost 50,000. So to zoom out before I do the big reveal, and I'm going to get you to, for yourselves, guess what you think these are. Substance 1, we can see, has the highest cost in criminal justice involvement and a moderate middle ground death rate. Okay, substance 3 has by far and away the highest death rate, but not a lot of criminal justice involvement, but does have moderate cost to society. Substance 2 is very much the lowest cost to society in terms of financial cost. Middle ground criminal justice, but still 1 in 10 is pretty moderate. And at the time, the death rate was the lowest of the 3 substances. Okay, so I'd like you to guess which of these substances are. Okay, so one of them is tobacco, one of them is alcohol, and one of them is opioids. Okay, so tobacco, alcohol, and opioids. Okay, so I'm going to give you a chance to think about that just a minute, and then I'm going to do the big reveal here. There's no cheating. Hopefully no one's doing any internet research here. All right, so here's the big reveal. Substance 1 is alcohol. Okay, so this may surprise folks, but alcohol is the substance which plays the most significant role in criminal justice involvement, in crimes being committed, in breaches. It has the much highest cost to society and a substantial rate of people dying of alcohol-related deaths every year. The number 2 one, when alcohol, of course, is legalized, is legal. To opioids is the second one, and so this would include heroin, fentanyl, that sort of thing. And as you can see, the death rates have obviously gone up, but it's still on a national basis lower than alcohol and tobacco, so still lower in terms of deaths per year. But again, interesting. It's the one that's criminalized here of these 3. Okay. Tobacco, by far and away the highest death rate, but not criminalized, not really much. It's probably contraband tobacco is what I would assume the 0.1% is for, if people are kind of wondering what that would relate to. People don't generally smoke and then do something. If they do, it's for other reasons. It's not related to the substance, and having a fairly substantial cost to society. So the big takeaway here, and why we're kind of starting with this, is that what's the headline in red on the slide, right? Neither public expenditures, how much things cost to society, the harm that they cause to people in terms of deaths, or their risk, which we'll get to in a second. None of those explain why a substance is criminalized or not. It's kind of interesting, because if you were to start from scratch and say, hey, let's kind of just get in a room and let's assume we're going to go the route of criminalizing things. That's a question that I have, is whether we do that. I say we shouldn't, but if you were to go to that route and say, look, we're going to criminalize some substances because they're bad, what are some criteria we would use? You'd probably say things like, hey, if a lot of people are committing crimes while using them, if a lot of people are dying from them, and it's costing us a lot of money and they're hurting themselves and others, there's 5 criteria right there. That sounds pretty good. I would be hard pressed as a policy advisor to think of better top level criteria to use. And yet none of that criteria is what in practice has been or is currently being used to determine whether a substance is criminalized. Here's a few graphics that just further illustrate this for those of you who are visual people. This is the attribution of deaths over several years. We have alcohol on the left, tobacco, right beside it is cannabis, and then in blue is opioids, and then it goes down to some other substances, which are not we're not talking too much about today. The next slide is about harms. So we've talked about harms in terms of people dying from the substances. There's also, of course, harm that happens to other people. And so that was alluded to a little bit in the criminal justice piece, but there's other harms as well. So I'm going to read these off because the slide's going to be really hard to read, maybe on your screen, depending where you're coming from. So don't worry, I'll walk through this. This is from The Lancet, which is, one of the leading medical journals in the world. They did a study consulting huge number of independent experts about harm to people who use a substance and harm to others of various substances. So in the blue is the relative harm to users. They, of course, had a quantitative scale they used to determine all this stuff. If you're interested, I can send you a link to the article. And in red is harm to others. And then they put those two things together to aggregate to say, well, this is the total harm. So on the far left here, the highest total harm to users and others is alcohol. Okay. Next up, we have heroin. Thirdly is crack cocaine. Fourth is meth. Then we've got cocaine. Tobacco pops in right here. Okay. And then we go down, here's cannabis. I'm just kind of going to highlight a couple that are that kind of jump out. We've got ecstasy over here. Here's LSD, and mushrooms is at the beginning. So again, the big takeaway from this is that the most harmful substances in terms of harm to others and self doesn't correlate at all with the decision to criminalize those substances. If it did, alcohol would be criminalized. And the time when it was with alcohol prohibition, we saw what happened there. It was something called the iron law of prohibition. And I talk about this a lot in my book. It's a really important concept. It's very counterintuitive. And that's why it's something I talk to a lot of people about. Because when I learned it, I'm like, this makes sense, but I didn't realize it's counterintuitive. So the iron law of prohibition in one sentence is the harder the enforcement, the harder the drug, or the harder the substance. Okay, the harder the enforcement, the harder the substance. So what that meant with alcohol prohibition is something most people would probably have kind of at least heard of or maybe a little bit familiar with. So before prohibition, people are drinking beer, and sure, there's wine and some hard liquor. Okay, what happens with prohibition is if you're gonna smuggle alcohol, you're not gonna do a very good job. You're gonna be more likely to get caught if you're smuggling beer, something that has between like 5 and 10% alcohol content. So what do? Well, you distill it down so it's the highest possible alcohol content, or at least a very high alcohol content, so that when you ship it and smuggle it, you're less likely. It's less bulky. So instead of shipping something that's like has this much alcohol, is this bulky and only has 10% alcohol, you can ship something with the same amount of alcohol that's 80% proof that's only this much. So this is where the idea of moonshine comes in. People actually did go blind and did actually die from alcohol poisoning, from drinking alcohol that was too potent during prohibition. It's not just a kind of urban legend. It's actually true. That did happen. Now prohibition ended for many other reasons, and I wouldn't say that harm was the main reason at all. But the point being that I'm trying to make today is the iron law of prohibition is when you prohibit a substance and make it illegal and to possess and to traffic and to manufacture, it creates a incentive to make it more potent. It turns out that's exactly what happened, and it's one of the major factors precipitating the toxic contaminated drug crisis in Canada, and what would be described as the second wave of the opioid epidemic or crisis in the United States. Okay? The first in the US being driven by overprescribing. We did not have that same first wave situation in Canada. And that we don't see the same phenomenon. That's not to say that prescription policies don't play a role in Canada, but I'm just pointing something out that's different from the US, and many people aren't aware of that either. So the iron law of prohibition basically says the better you do at the war on drugs, the worse things actually get. And that's what we see. So we actually have data, it's published in my book Overdose, which shows over decades as global seizures of things like cannabis, of heroin, and of cocaine, those three drugs in particular, as global drug seizures accelerated over time, what happens on the street is those substances actually got more potent right? Because again, it's just like from beer to moonshine. So they got more potent. We have actual percentages to back that up because the police do drug seizures or drug buys and test the drugs. So that's what it's based on. And they became less expensive. Isn't that wild? So it had the exact opposite effect. The whole idea is, hey, if we seize all this stuff, it's going to increase the cost and it'll reduce the demand. That doesn't happen. You also don't reduce demand by increasing price when someone has a substance use disorder. That is something that economists would describe as an inelastic demand. It's like if gasoline, I shouldn't use it. I'm not going to use an analogy. Other things in society that have that same demand, as the price goes up, you still are buying them. You still have to buy them. That's the reason why, saying, oh, if there's like if there even were a 15 or 20% increase in drug costs, people just stop using them. It just doesn't happen. And in fact, what we find is that even if there is a major drug seizure, so you see on the news, maybe your local police does this, like our police force in Vancouver did just last month. They put it on the table and they have the drugs on the table and they'll have some bills of cash and some Ziploc bags. And if they're lucky, they'll maybe find some things that look like weapons, or maybe there are real weapons, and they'll put it on the table in front of the media. And this is kind of justifies what they're doing. It turns out that those don't actually have an impact in terms of stopping people from using drugs. It doesn't have any kind of impact even on the price, even over the immediate term maybe, but within a very short period of time, the research shows that it doesn't. And so that's essentially a big show. Right? It's a big show justifying, larger police budgets to deal with something which I'm going to get to is not going to be solved by a criminal justice response. This is a public health issue. Look at what we're talking about. We're talking about tobacco, talking about alcohol. There are things that have been done to try to mitigate those harms. And part of the problem is, on the one hand, you have prohibition, which is we've been talking about a lot. On the other hand, if you swing all the way to the other side, all the way, you have commercialization. So it's actually past decriminalization, regulation, legalization, you have commercialization. So that's what we have with alcohol. So that's why you have like beer ads and marketing. And we used to see that with tobacco. There was a lot more, and that there were laws brought in to stop that, because if you go all the way to commercialization, that increases people's usage and harms, right? And so when we look at different models to regulate or deal with to deal with substances, what the sort of sweet spot is believed to be is a regulated approach to substances. So not using criminal law, but using public health approaches, doing things like limitations on advertising, ensuring that there's quality control standards. There's a lot of public education, right? And also realizing that doing the research. Why are people using the substances? So with tobacco, one of the major factors that influences long-term smoking, for example, for years was found to be education and socioeconomic levels, right? And so those things play a bigger role in the equation, right? So this is to start us off. So if it's not harm to self or others, if it's not cost to society, if it's not deaths, what explains why certain substances are legal that many of you probably had last night or tonight? It was Friday night, last night or tonight. Maybe you had a glass of wine or a beer. You're legally allowed to do that, even though at certain levels we know it's harmful. And there's, of course, a debate, or at least there's new news on what those levels are. Same thing with smoking or vaping or anything like that. So what explains it? Well, it turns out it's history, not harm, as the title of this article says, dictates why some drugs are legal and others aren't. And in the case of opioids, which is the main substance that I'm just sort of talking about today, I have a chapter in my book Overdose, which explores this and gets into some detail. But essentially, the first criminal prohibition on opioids in Canada, the first legal prohibition rather, appeared in racial exclusion laws in British Columbia here. And it was under what was called the Chinese Regulation Act, an incredibly racist act, which the BC legislature tried to pass in 1884, right after the, as the Trans-Pacific Railway is being finished. Large numbers of Chinese workers were here, and then the decision almost as soon as they're finished working is we don't want them to stay. And so there were these incredibly racist laws. I pulled from the historical record from both at the level of the Premier of BC and the Prime Minister of Canada. The most vitriolic white supremacy is not an understatement. If you've read the book, you know that. You can take a look at those and see for yourself. But to give a sense of where our criminal prohibitions on opioids began, it was here. And so the concept of, opium dens, which were in the time in the province of British Columbia, they were seen as not a place where there was any kind of disorder or crime happening. That was for the saloons and the bars, actually. Instead, there were, and I quote from some of them in the book, the main concern was that white women would go and be seduced to go to these opium dens, and that there would be an intermixing of races. You can read it for yourself. It is absolutely shocking stuff. And I'm not talking like back page of the local newspaper. This gets picked up by the federal government when it sent someone to investigate the anti-Asian riots that happened in Vancouver, just 10 minutes from my house. And the great irony is that the federal government sent someone to look at and deal with, the riots, the violence committed against Chinese and Japanese and other citizens, and what to do about it and what sort of compensation was needed. And instead of focusing on that issue, the representative sent by the federal government decided that they were going to look at this issue as well. And so they wrote a report, as far as I can tell, actually the report's pretty clear about this. It's fairly impromptu and not part of the plan, about why we should criminalize opioids at the national level. And that report was the genesis of it. And it directly quotes newspaper articles saying that, white women are going to lose their virtue because of opium dens. Okay, so to be clear, there is not today, nor has there ever been a public policy reason for excluding opioids that's based as criminalizing them that's based on evidence. There's no evidence-based, nothing that certainly could be consistent across the board with like alcohol, tobacco, and now cannabis. Okay, so the evidence is not on the side of criminalizing these substances, nor has it ever been. There's never been a good reason to do it. And it's backfired. It hasn't worked. You'll often hear people saying things like conservative politicians, look what's happening in BC, and it was point over here, even though in fact the majority of overdose deaths in Canada are outside of BC, even though the percentage per capita is very high here still, of course. And they'll say, look what's happening. That's the result of progressive drug policies. Well, that's totally not true. In fact, most of the policy measures I'm going to talk about have been sort of half-heartedly, we would say, kind of implemented here in the province. And certainly the opioid crisis was not caused by them. The opioid crisis was, we can see, directly caused by the drug prohibition, the war on drugs, and changes that were made to actually crack down on the abuse of prescription drugs, in particular OxyContin. So that's all unpacked in the book. So that's a lot to get through though, right? So like, how long I've been talking for now? Quite a while. How long do you have on the news? How long do you have with your friend who's talking about this stuff? This unlearning takes time, and people don't have time. So how do we do this, right? How do you go about explaining this stuff to people? I think the starting point would be, hey, you know what? Did you know that more people actually die from like alcohol and tobacco than from opioids? And that alcohol is way more involved in criminal justice than opioids. So, hey, why do you think that we criminalize some substances and not others? And I'm going, you know what I found out? Guess what? It actually started because it was is a racist thing against Chinese people in British Columbia. No, it couldn't be. Yeah, check it out. Here's this book. Okay, that's a minute. So you can boil this stuff down for people. I do, but it's good to hear the whole story, perhaps. Now, I'm not going to go through all this in detail because I want to leave lots of time for a few more things to share, and then of course Q&A. But what are the costs then? So if there's no good reason for criminalization of people who use substances, particularly we're talking about opioids and other hard drugs, so-called hard quote unquote drugs today, and that's not a term that I use, but people have an idea of what they mean when they hear that. I've talked about the first one. The second one, these laws that were brought in predate any knowledge of modern psychology, of addictions medicine, anything like that. So they didn't really know that. Again, they thought it was a moral failing. Today we understand better. Criminalizing substances like opioids, it punishes people for having substance use disorders. The definition of an addiction or a substance use disorder is continuing to do something, persistent use, despite wanting to use less or to stop. And so it's wrong to punish someone for something that they're not, have full agency over. Thirdly, it fuels stigma. It makes it more likely that people are going to use alone, use quickly, and use in dangerous conditions. It isolates people from support. It gives them criminal records. It keeps them from accessing certain services. It can get them fired from their jobs. it fosters other criminal and risky behaviors for people who don't have the financial means to pay for these substances, which are very expensive with monopoly prices that criminal organizations charge you because it's criminals who are providing them. It can lead to things like, break-in enters, breaking into vehicles, survival sex work, that kind of stuff. Number 7, this is a really significant one and something that I headline as well when I talk about this issue, is that it dramatically increases the risk of death of people to incarcerate them. So whatever they're incarcerated for, okay, could be anything. If you have a substance use disorder, you are 50 times more likely to overdose if you are within the 2 weeks you're released from prison than if you hadn't been incarcerated. 50 times, 50. So it is like a death sentence to send many people to prison who have substance use disorders. And it wouldn't surprise you to hear the vast majority of people incarcerated in Canada do have substance use disorders. And then finally, it raises barriers to rehabilitation. So there are, for example, a lot of housing you can't get or stay in if you're using substances. Certain programs you get into, you wouldn't be able to do that as well. So the costs of criminalization are substantial, and it is not helping. It is making things worse. So what happens when organizations like Moms Stop the Harm bring these issues forward? Well, this is one of the responses that you get. Justin Trudeau said this, and I heard this from Leslie went on the record with it, and there's a couple of government officials who backed up what she said, who wouldn't be named, that were in the same meeting. When they asked Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, why he wouldn't decriminalize these substances, he said, "You have no idea what I've been through across the country trying to deal with the marijuana and cannabis issue. I can tell you straight out, it's not happening." So what is that? What's he saying? What's the reason? He's saying it's too politically difficult for me. I'm worried about my job, right? That's what he's saying. He's not saying what you heard publicly, which is, oh, we need to make sure there's a proper system in place and this, that, and the other. And once there is, then we can do it. No, the reason is political. And I think that's horrific. I'm glad that we can expose it, and we should expose it. And so, our drug laws should not be based on ignorance, fear, ideology, politics, stereotypes, but on evidence and compassion. So we've got to the point now where we know drug policy is not evidence-based in Canada. It is largely based on social, cultural baggage, racism. I would also say racism against discrimination against people who are poor and homeless, because again, it gets associated with that as well. So you get into discrimination and stigma against them as well. This is at all levels of government. We see this at the federal, provincial, and also municipal levels as well. A lot of city councils, local mayors as well continue to pursue a crime and punishment style approach. Now, evidence is not determinative then in this debate, but it's not irrelevant. Okay, it's a good thing that the truth is on our side, as it were, that the evidence is on our side on this particular issue. The reason I'm focusing so much on the criminalization piece, in case you're wondering, is because a lot of this flows from that too. So if we're willing to get to the point of this is not a criminal justice problem, it doesn't get solved through criminal justice means, then we treat it as a public health issue, and all of the solutions to it are public health issues that I'm going to put on screen in just a second. Okay. Overdose deaths cross party lines. So remember, no matter what the sort of talking head is saying for any particular party, there are people who maybe have voted or supported that party who are hearing those messages going, well, hang on a second, like, you want to continue to criminalize people? Like, I know that that's not going to help. Like, I don't support that. We have loved ones in our family, for example, who've experienced addiction or overdose death. We don't like what you're saying, right? And it's stigma that often holds that back. And so that's part of the issue around why there isn't a greater groundswell of opposition to punitive, ineffective, costly, deadly drug policies that we see today still happening. It's because of the stigma around, who's going to stand up. So if everyone instead had died from contaminated drinking water, imagine there was lead in the drinking water supply, and that's where we got instead of the deaths from toxic contaminated drugs, it was lead in the drinking water. Do you think we'd still be here, in 2023, good 8 years in to the current crisis, still talking and having webinars like this? It would have been solved almost immediately, okay? Unless it was on an Indigenous reservation. because we still have toxic drinking water in a countless number of Indigenous reservations. And so again, to remember, why is it different? It's whose lives are mattering, whose deaths count for more. So it gets back to the idea of stigma, right? The high stigma is for people who use substances. And then yes, it does cross all kind of lines of society, but people are disproportionately affected, include Indigenous peoples, because of the ongoing impacts of residential schools and colonialism. And so the real moral wrong, as I say, in overdose is not the folks who are using substances. The real moral wrong is we as a society for heaping judgment, condemnation, and blame on them, and not turning the mirror around and looking at our own role. I say this as someone who's a white settler, our own role in creating the trauma, providing the substance, and then punishing its use. That's the triple wrong of the colonial drug policy that we still see today, to give a specific example. So we're dealing with a population which is, double, triple, quadruple marginalized and disenfranchised. And so there's a lot of uphill to go. So I'm not going to get into the policies in detail. These are all outlined in the book. Some of you are familiar with some of this stuff. But this is an example of a holistic drug policy. In the book, I call it the Vancouver Declaration, just because the research was done in Vancouver mainly, and that's where many of these programs got started. Right now, there's a current, I would call it a debate, but it's not really a debate, current dialogue around whether we do, safer supply and harm reduction, or whether we do treatment. No idea why it's an or, other than that it's politically, attractive for conservative politicians to do that. They're not willing to follow the evidence. They're not willing to do that. They all want to claim to be compassionate, though. You'll notice they all try to co-opt that word. So I come back and I say, it's not an either or. Okay, we need to help people stay alive. Not everyone's ready to go into treatment, and treatment's not always available. The optimal time window for someone to get into treatment who wants to is actually 2 hours. And when I asked people who are in the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority, where I live, how long would it take? And I actually asked that question back in January. I had the coastal health decriminalization leads come and meet with me. And I said, hey, a few years ago, I was told it's 2 hour window. And, back then it was like a 6 month, you'd take about like 6 months to get into some sort of recovery or treatment support program. I said, are we down to 2 hours yet? And they're like, not even close. So the idea of having rapid access to treatment and prioritizing that is absolutely key. And so to say, oh, people just need to get a recovery, you need to get a treatment. Looking at some of the research, people who had access to injectable opioid agonist treatment, so this is being provided with prescribed safer supply. In some of the studies, they had tried over a dozen, I think it was close to 16 times. 16 times they tried different treatment and recovery options, and they had not been able to do it. And these are people who are long-term intravenous drug users. And so it's not an either or. It's not like you either have this or you have this. It's like these were people who were really trying, very motivated to stop using, but they weren't able to. And all those programs probably weren't evidence-based. So things that we need to do include start with helping people stay alive. So that's where you see it. Let's begin with the policy recommendations. Make naloxone freely and widely available. We only are seeing that now in the United States, for example, just like in the last few months. Okay, that for the longest time, people, certain Republican governors were saying, well, if we provide naloxone, that's going to encourage drug use. Like wild, ridiculous statements like that, which were again not backed by evidence. So this first one is not at all controversial, but it's an example of where we start with. So the first step is working with people. I go through this kind of list, and these build on each other, I would say. So I would start out by saying, like, if they weren't on board with naloxone, be like, hey, if someone is overdosed, like there's a there's a medication we can use to overcome the overdose. Like, should give it to them, right? Well, yeah, of course. Only the most horrific person would say no, and we're not going to get anywhere with them, quite frankly. And they have other issues probably going on in their life. And then we go, okay, so you're okay with us providing a substance to temporarily reverse the effects of an overdose. Yeah. You're okay with us like providing like rescue breathing, like CPR and oxygen if they need it. Yeah, of course, yeah, okay, yeah, sure. Like that's pretty, most people would say 100%. So then we get to the next one and we go, okay, are you okay with people who are using substances that are illegal? Like they can't get legal drugs, they're addicted. If they're going to use them, are you okay with us like having them be in like a place where someone can just watch them use them? And if they do overdose, if they literally hit the ground, that we would go and do the same thing. We'd give them naloxone and we'd give them oxygen if they need it, and call the ambulance and help them out if they needed that. Well, yeah. Well, guess what? That's an overdose prevention site. That's all it is. There's a lot of stigma and misunderstanding around what are overdose prevention sites. What I described is an overdose prevention site. you know, and you can add on, yeah, and that they're not using the same syringe or sharing it, which can, you know, which we know is a way to transmit communicable diseases like hepatitis and HIV/AIDS, like clean syringe, like they're going to use anyway. That's always something that I kind of point out. They're going to use. So it's either they're in the back alley, or they're hiding in the back room of their home, or they're in their vehicle, you know, or they're in a recovery center trying to get off, but they're having a relapse. Okay. Or we can take them out of the secrecy. Say, you're going to use, we want you to be safe. Okay. You're not ready to go into recovery or treatment yet. Okay. But you're going to use, so we want to keep you alive. Okay. So the other thing that I point out to folks then is say, hey, did you know the research actually shows that then when you bring them into these safe places to use and take them out of the unsafe places, that they actually then have some human contact with people, whether it's peers or a public health nurse, you know, and, you know, that's where they can get actually, the research shows people actually then make a decision sometimes to get into treatment. Not always, but there's evidence that they do. They're more likely to get into treatment. Sounds great, right? It's a gateway there. And then we get into 3 and we go, you know what? Some people, when, you know, let's provide that in a rapid way. Remember that thing, 2 hours, 2 hours. You can't do that. So these politicians are all talking about treatment, recovery. The standard needs to be rapid access. And again, to evidence-based treatment. Most conservative politicians, when they talk about treatment, are talking about abstinence-based treatment. They're talking about getting people to go cold turkey and thinking that's the way to go. The research is super clear on this. It's been clear for decades. British medical journal studies, you name it, that people who quote unquote successfully complete a 28-day detox program are actually more likely to die from overdose than those who quote unquote failed out of the program. So in other words, the treatment is actually more likely to kill people. Now, does that mean that some form of detox has never worked for anybody? No, but we can't make policy on anecdotes. And the best advice that published in the Canadian Medical Journal is that you need to have treatment that is evidence-based. So that looks different for different people, and the medical guidelines provide examples of things like methadone or Suboxone that can be used to help people to deal with the withdrawal, the debilitating withdrawal symptoms, the need for psychological counseling, right? The need for safer housing or secure housing. Okay, so when we talk about treatment, we want to talk about 2 things. One is it's rapid. Okay, so it's quick. You have ready access to it. And number 2, it's evidence-based. It's proof that it will work. In other words, that people will actually be successful in either getting off one measure. One goal could be to reduce dependence on illegal street drugs, and then get them on a safer supply, which I'll talk about in a minute. One goal may be to reduce use. One goal may be to stop using. One goal may be, you know, something else. So it's individualized. So we can't force everyone to go on a detox only program, right? That's not going to work. In fact, it will, we know at a population level, be in fact counterproductive. When we get to number 4, this is where a lot of the debate is right now, is around safer supply. And what is safer supply? Well, essentially it's substituting a substance that is created by criminals in their basements or garages or, you know, drug labs, mixed often with kitchen blenders. That's the police have said they found. Okay, so it's totally unscientific to say the least. And replacing that substance someone's going to use anyway with a substance which is comparable, but it's of known contents and potency. So you know what it is. You're not playing Russian roulette. Okay, and that's why we call it the contaminated toxic drug crisis. The reason that people are dying from overdose deaths in this situation is they have no idea what's in the drugs they're taking, and they don't have any idea what the potency of it is. So one day it's this, one day it's that. It's your body is just not able. And we're talking about the differences, grains of sand. That's how potent the substances are. It's grains of sand making the difference between a fatal and a non-fatal interaction with the drug. So a safer supply is about substituting those things. When we do that, the evidence, the growing body of evidence is that when you provide a safer supply to someone, it first of all reduces their dependency on the illegal drugs. That should be obvious, but it actually does do that. It also reduces potential criminal involvement, so it reduces that as well. And it has helped people to stabilize, to, for example, continue and maintain jobs, right? To go and get their education finished, to be a productive member of society, as the term would be. Okay, I don't like that term, to be honest, but that's something that you often hear as sort of a goal of drug policy. Well, it turns out that it's not necessarily the effects of the substance on someone that is the primary source of issue in their life, although for many people, like, say that it is, but it's it can be, but it's actually the fact that it is criminalized, and that's what leads to a lot of the other issues as well. So there's a combination of that harm to self, harm to others, which is certainly related to the substance itself, just to be clear. But then there is also a big part of it that's related to the fact that it is illegal and all the issues that come around that. So safer supply is an important, crucial part of this because, again, the proximate cause of the overdose deaths we see in Canada are it's illegal street drugs. It's the lead contaminated drinking water. So we're talking about, instead of that, here's a bottle of drinking water that doesn't have the contaminants in it. Fifthly, and I alluded to this at the beginning with the First Nations Health Authority, we need a more holistic response. That means actually starting to deal with underlying issues like childhood trauma. We know someone who experiences moderate levels of childhood trauma. So, things like physical, sexual abuse, parents who divorced, were incarcerated, had mental health issues, they witnessed family violence. As you accumulate these adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, you are dramatically more likely to experience a whole host of negative life outcomes, including using substances and dying from overdose. So that's why a more holistic response is needed, including things like housing, educational supports, that sort of thing. Number 6, strongly advocate for more support for Indigenous communities, frontline and peer-based organizations and families, groups like Mom Stop the Harm in that list for sure. And 7, what we've been talking about all day, then we get to is decriminalization. So, so this is what I recommend as sort of what we should be doing. And we're doing some of this stuff a little bit half-heartedly. We have not gone all in on this. We have not actually tried scaling up safer supply. We haven't done it in conjunction with rapid access to treatment. Like we're not doing this anywhere in Canada at all. And so this is where the evidence points to. So if this is the evidence-based approach, how do we get people on board since evidence doesn't decide drug policy? Well, here's some key messages, and this is where I'll end. First is substance use is a health issue, not a criminal one. You've heard me say that again and again. We need to keep saying it. Next one, I point out many people, not all people, but many people use drugs to medicate the pain and trauma in their lives. And opioids are actually by definition painkillers. That's what they are. If you've ever been in a medical setting and you've been given a pain medicine, chances are it was an opioid. I was given fentanyl for a medical procedure I found out, years ago. Third, look, punishing people for having an addiction it's cruel. It's just, it's wrong. It's costly. It's ineffective, and it doesn't work. It's deadly. So those are the words I use. It's cruel, costly, ineffective, and deadly to punish someone for having an addiction. Look, when people use these toxic street drugs and they're alone, they're way more likely to die. So this is where we get into saying, like, let's help people come inside. Like, let's bring them into these safe places like overdose prevention sites. Let's substitute those toxic drugs criminals gave them with something that they know what's in there. That's going to save lives, reduce costs, help them stabilize. And people need to be alive to get a chance at recovery. Let's ensure that we have rapid access when people are, if and when they're willing and interested to get into recovery and treatment, that they can do that within 2 hours, instead of investing more money on policing and jails and prisons and cops, which, again, it's not going to work. We've tried that. Doubling down on that is not going to help, right? So what role can you play in advancing this? There are groups of people who you know and interact with who I don't know. Same thing with me. There's people that I can interact with and speak to. I'll give you just one quick example of this. I got asked to speak at a church. I'm publicly disclosed that I'm a follower of Jesus. So what happens? A pastor read my book and he said, "Hey, would you mind coming on a Sunday morning and talking to church?" There's like 300 people, and they had members of their congregation who are in recovery, and they're very open about it. And they had a large number of folks who came. They invited, I think, the whole kind of recovery center community there. And I spoke on a Sunday morning, and I talked about a lot of what we talked about here, but then I also, of course, brought in, because it was a Sunday morning service, I brought in a faith-based perspective and explained why, as a Christian, I thought it was necessary to take this kind of compassionate approach. And that was really exciting. So I bring that up as an example. If that's a group that I could reach, that some of you would be like, "Oh, I would never do that," or "I don't know that. No." Guess what? Think of an analogy for you. Maybe there's people who you can reach out to, who you can talk to, who I can't. So we have to build a much more diverse, much more vocal movement really around this issue. And I see, Mom Stop the Harm has done, quite frankly, more than any other organization I can think of to do that. So in many ways, speaking of preaching, it's like preaching to the choir, right? So that's where I'll end. Just leave you with my contact information and mention about this next book, because I think you'll be quite interested in it. There's a substantial part on the book, obviously, that continues to advocate for these policies chapter 2 is all about substance use, so get right into it at the beginning, and public health approaches to what we deal with criminal law wise right now. So yeah, there's my email, website, and social media. Please contact me. I love speaking to different groups of people, and if you'd like to hear more, get updates about the book Indictment, we're actually going to give away a copy, I think, today, pre-order. It's coming out in October, and all the proceeds from that book are going to organizations that support survivors, offenders, and their families too. So so for that one, stay tuned, and if you're interested, you can even pre-order a copy today. So, and I think we're going to give away a copy of Overdose too. So I'll end there, and hopefully we've still got a good bit of time for questions. Thanks.
Awesome, Ben. I mean, I loved how you put it all together and how you gave us the concrete facts, because I find that so many people that I talk to and as we're sharing need those kind of tidbits and, you know, those kind of pieces that you shared with us today. And yes, that's one thing I did forget to mention is we will be giving away a copy of both of those books, complimentary from Ben. And I want to, because we do have a bit of time, so I want to get into some of the questions to make sure that we have time for that. I'm going to start with a couple of questions that are not in the Q&A box. There was somebody that contacted me and asked, they weren't able to be here today, so they because they were actually presenting at an event and using your book and lots of
Wow, cool.
thing in there. So I've got a couple questions, so I'm just going to go through them really quickly, and then we'll get to the ones in the Q&A, and then we will wrap up. So I just wondered what he suggests when dealing with first responders so they can provide a more compassionate response. So just a little bit about the backstory is some of the media that every time police come to a house, they come wearing respirators because they know fentanyl is involved. The stigma, you know, that's created around that. People, it takes longer for first responders to respond. They automatically gear up when they hear the word that fentanyl, or the risk about being exposed to fentanyl. And I haven't been able to find much scientific literature to back up any stories, and they have analyzed many stories. So that was the first question.
Yeah, great question. It's a great urban legend that, you know, a police officer touched some fentanyl and overdosed. You cannot, your skin is not, this is not me as a lawyer, this is me talking to physicians and that, right? Like your skin is not absorbing substances. Like this is like, it's not possible. It hasn't happened. It never has happened. And if you go on the internet and try to find a story, you'll very quickly find those stories getting debunked. There's folks all over social media who are, you know, like PhDs in public health who are constantly like, my feeds are full of this, like, here's another story, didn't happen. It is right up there with the, it's actually even more of an urban legend than the, like, you know, needles and candy stories in Halloween. Okay. How many remember that? Like every single Halloween. It's like, and then it'll become like, hey, has that ever happened? And like, well, it did happen one time in Ohio, or like, so, you know, there's always this, oh yeah, it happened to somebody somewhere, somehow. Yeah, there's a lot of stigma around that. The other one I hear about with first responders is they get burned out and they start to lose their compassion. And I've heard this from them. This isn't me judging them. And I have to say, I get that. I'm not them. I don't do their day-to-day job. I think that would be really difficult coming back the fourth or fifth time and having the same person overdosed. And so I try to talk to them about saying, hey, what do you think is really going on there? You know what? And so that's where the stuff around childhood trauma really comes in, and say, hey, yeah, did you know that like someone is like seven times more likely to develop a substance use disorder if they experience childhood trauma? One of the stories in my book that I allude to is a judge in BC. I asked her and I said, hey, tell me about some of the folks who are before your court on, you know, drug charges. What's their life story like? And she said, well, I'll give you an example. She said not one, but multiple, at least two people so they both happened to be Indigenous men. And they were, as children, as toddlers, witnessed their mothers being murdered. And they were left alone with the body for days. And that's how and she's like, yeah, and they're using painkillers as adults. They're using street drugs to medicate that pain, which obviously never got dealt with. And so, you know, I think something else I think about is many of us can relate to having addictions to other thing. I've got a big list I use in some talks, It's got shopping, it's got social media on there. It's also got volunteering, by the way, and over serving and over caring as a way to, basically an addiction can be anything that you're doing to avoid dealing with your feelings, right? It's anything, can be anything. And we all have them or have had them. And many of us have had multiple ones we go to. So I wish I brought the list to Antoinette. I can share it later if people are interested, but yeah. And the reason I do that is to say, look, if those things killed you quickly, most of us wouldn't be alive still. And so we all are turning to different things and have done that at some point. And so we need to be more compassionate. So yeah, so that's what I would say about that question.
Okay, thank you. Now the other one is, and I won't read the whole thing, but you know, I'm going to summarize. When people have been criminalized because of a situation and their lawyer recommends just pleading guilty, and then that the lawyer just said please guilty, then the person ends up with a criminal record when it shouldn't have been in the first place. You know, the situation, the scenario that unfolded is the person was charged with I don't want to get it wrong, assault with a weapon. The weapon was actually a kitty litter scoop.
Yeah.
And that was
Yeah.
the weapon. But now now they're in the situation where they have a criminal record. Number one, they don't have the means to pay. You know, so the question is, when people do not have the means to pay for a lawyer and are told by the lawyer to just plead guilty to something they end up having a criminal record with, when they should not have, is there any recourse for lawyers that do that?
Short answer is no. I just put my contact info in the chat for people if they're interested, but that short answer is no. So ethically a criminal defense lawyer can only represent you on a guilty plea if you admit to having committed the factual aspects of the offense. And you get informed, you know, here's the sentencing range. I can't guarantee, even if we have a deal with the Crown, that you're going to get that. The judge can give you a higher sentence. And making sure you're obviously, you know, you're competent to give a plea. That's it. So they're actually doing their job if they represent you in that way. They're supposed to advise you as well of, you know, kind of, if we went to trial, here's the pros and cons, here's the risks in that. Our justice system, and this is where I get into it a lot in my next book, Indictment, is absolutely stacked against people who do not have a lawyer. And this is not just a kind of side swipe at I'm a lawyer. It's not as a side swipe at lawyers. It's true. I mean, you are way more likely to first of all have charges dropped entirely. Secondly, to have get a better plea bargain if you have a represented by legal counsel. Thirdly, if you do go to trial, you're more likely to succeed. This shouldn't surprise people, but it's true. And the other one that's really huge is, if someone is denied, there's a lot of talk right now about people who are out on bail, and we need to crack down on bail. That's a really big issue right now. It's been publicly being talked about. And the problem is, if people are denied bail, so that means they're alleged to have committed an offense, and they're kept in custody while awaiting trial. If you're charged with something, let's say, that would, if you were convicted, only get you a 90-day sentence, which is a very common sentence. Like, not everyone gets years and years, okay? A 90-day sentence, or even a 6-month sentence, or even an 18-month sentence. If you do the math and you are in jail and it's gone past 90 days and your lawyer's like, any good lawyer should tell you, or maybe you do the math yourself, or the Crown comes and offers the deal to you without a lawyer. Hey, guess what? You've been in jail for 90 days already. The most you're going to get if you're found guilty is 90 days. So your options, I'll put it to you, Antoinette, your options are, you can stand on principle. Your trial's not happening for another year. Another year. And this is not an institution, place you want to be. Pretrial detention facilities in Canada, some of them are absolutely horrific. They're places of tremendous violence and harm. Your life is literally at risk there. There's a risk of abuse by guards as well as fellow inmates. You're presumed innocent. Maybe you are innocent. Maybe you aren't, but the incentive is so powerful to plead out. Okay. And now if I add on top of that, it's, and I'm not going to say you, because I don't know your background story, but I'll pick somebody else. So one of the folks I interviewed for my book, she basically said, yeah, I just take what they offer me. Like, what else am I supposed to do? They say to me, like, you can plead to this. So what happens then is you got the record. Now, it's not even that, it gets worse from there. So not only do you have the record, but the next time, now you're out on conditions. They're going to give you conditions that you not do all these things. You're literally 5 minutes late for your curfew. You're going to be back in custody. And then they go, or you commit some fresh offense supposedly, or maybe it's you're using a substance you're addicted to again. They go, let's get this straight. This is the logic, the quote unquote logic of the system. You just 90 days didn't work. So now we're going to double it. Let's do 180 days. So now what happens? That doesn't work. I don't want to get too far ahead of what we're going to talk about in the fall, but this cascades to the point where we interview people for our studies who've been in prison since they were 12 years old, which is the youngest you can be incarcerated in Canada is 12 years old. They start being incarcerated at 12 years old. And by the time they're 39, there's a particular woman I'm thinking of immediately right now. She was the first person who responded to our poster asking for someone to talk about their experience with the system. By the age of 39, she had spent 25 years in prison and combined. Now, that has had she's destroyed her life, okay? And how much do you think that's cost us? It's $116,000 per year just to incarcerate someone, plus the policing costs, plus the healthcare costs, plus everything else. So we have as a society, off the back of the envelope, probably spent between $3 to $5 million punishing this Indigenous woman since she was 12 years old. To what effect, right? What are we doing? It's horrific. And so, yeah, I'm going to be talking a lot more about that. And it really does put the system on trial using the testimony of people like that woman who I call Courtney in the book. If people read the book, that's who I'm talking about. Okay,
I want to keep moving along because I don't know, well, I don't think we're going to have time. We have a number of questions in the Q&A. So one of them, a quick one, Ben, do you think that fentanyl would be higher than heroin and cocaine now in that slide that you showed?
The Lancet slide. So there's two slides. So one was the deaths. So the deaths are higher, but it's still lower than alcohol and tobacco. So even with the the quote unquote opioid crisis, it's still lower than alcohol and tobacco deaths. And the harms to self and others, that hasn't, actually harm to self, I guess, if you had factored in the death risk of fentanyl, yeah, I think it would be fair to say it'd be higher. It's still lower than alcohol, though. The thing with alcohol is people can die immediately of alcohol death, right? People are aware of that, alcohol poisoning. But the way you hit those big numbers is people using alcohol over years, right? And typically dying of various cancers. And so that's why we don't have a quote unquote alcohol crisis in Canada, even though we do. Okay, we do have an alcohol crisis in Canada because it's such a slow burn. It's not as dramatic, and you're not getting the 911 calls and this and that and the other. It's this slow burn harm. But I have to say, in terms of criminal justice, it is massive. One of the things that they found of a study in Saskatchewan, if anyone's interested in the alcohol piece, I'd recommend a book to you. It's by the late Harold Johnson, and it's called Firewater. I'm loading people up on summer reading here.
Yay.
Okay. If you haven't read Overdose, please do. And then Harold Johnson's book, Firewater, talks a lot about substances, talks about alcohol. Up to 95% of crimes in Saskatchewan were committed while people were under the influence of alcohol. So we've got a really serious issue with alcohol as well that we need to be talking about. And a lot of people, it's not just one or the other, it's polydrug use. People are drinking and they're using these other substances. So it's not just a little neat category.
Right. Dr. John Marks, creator of heroin-assisted treatment, created the original concept of the paradox of prohibition. Where do you think safe supply falls into that paradox?
Yeah, is that the curve that people are thinking of? Is that I don't know if that's the person they're talking about, but yeah, so safer supply is an example of a regulated approach, and it falls within the so-called sweet spot of where you want to be. So again, prohibition is all at one. I could probably find a slide if we had more minutes with the graphic, but it's essentially a U. At one end we have prohibition, at the other side is commercialization, and at the bottom, which is where you have the lowest harms, is regulated access to the substance. So that's where you have things like you can access it legally and you're not criminal if you do, but we're going to put rules and restrictions around it. We're going to have quality control around it, that sort of thing.
My question to you is, how do you see the roles of peer-run organizations in supporting this work around criminalization and safe supply initiatives?
About peer-based, is that what you said?
Yeah, peer-run organizations
Yeah.
in supporting this work around criminalization and safe supply initiatives.
Yeah, I think there's really strong evidence that peer-based work is extraordinarily valuable and helpful. And there's the kind of formal peer-based organizations, but I would also just add that so many people I met who are executive directors or program managers in leading nonprofit organizations have addiction histories. They're in recovery. That is not uncommon. That's typical. It's wonderful. That's one of the things that you do when you are in recovery is you give back. You're able to look past your own self and look to the needs of others, and you want to pay it forward. And like that's where I found so much inspiration. And there were people who I met who in the course of writing Overdose and Indictment who shared that with me. And they said, I don't want you to mention this, but, and they would tell me. And so, yeah, fair enough. And we respect that. People's life experiences are their own, right? And if they want to share, they have, and there's no need to, but if they want to, they can. And I appreciated that I heard that from a number of different folks. And it is really encouraging. I mean, who better to walk that road with you? It's like with your support groups, right? You need to be walking alongside someone who has experienced something similar to you. Maybe it's not exactly the same, but it's because there's nothing worse. I know people would probably relate to this than thinking no one understands me, right? No one gets it. So to hear someone who gets it and can listen and be there and share it, I mean, that is such a huge thing. And so that's where you come to peer-based organizations doing that public health, life-saving public health work. It's incredible and it's so important. Yeah, on the piece around decriminalization, I think it's a little harder, to be honest. I think it's a little harder because I think the public is already kind of, like I said, has this high stigma against people who use drugs. So if people who use drugs are the ones saying we should decriminalize drugs, it's like the media is like, oh yeah, okay. Like it just doesn't pick up the traction. What got a lot of traction with cannabis legalization was when chiefs of police and mayors and a whole range of people were like, hey, we should decriminalize these things. And for a while, that was the route where we were going in Canada. But now we're seeing this backlash that's happening within the last year and a half, I would say, on this issue on that front, where conservative politicians at all levels are like, hey, no, we can win votes on demonizing drug users. Let's go back to our old tough on crime, or as I call it now, the stupid on crime playbook, because it doesn't work. It just costs a lot of money to punish people for what they're doing.
Just a quick question, and then I have a couple more, and then we're going to have to call it. The slides that you presented, are we able to provide those to people afterwards? Because some people had taken some screenshots and wanted to share it out. So is that okay for people to do? Please
do. You can screenshot, put it on social media, whatever you want to do. It's all, if it's at all helpful, I'll send it to you after the meeting.
Perfect. Thank you. And can you share information on how we can influence government policy advisors?
Yeah, so this is a broader conversation. And I think one of the things that's kind of interesting is that we should be doing direct advocacy with decision makers and their advisors. Absolutely. In a 30-second snapshot, just having worked in a minister's office, in the prime minister's office, and working with MPs, they have a kind of list of things that gets their attention. And number one is actually a letter, a written letter. So remember those things in the mail? When's the last time you do? That's the top of the list because it takes work. It's taken more seriously, and it's free to write your MP. I don't know if people knew that, but there's no postage required. You address it to the House of Commons address, and it's free. So a handwritten or a typed letter with your signature on it is considered the most significant. Next is a phone call. Okay. And when you call, you don't just ask to speak to them. You say, hey, I'm calling because, you give what your issue is and what you want them to do. Every issue has one side or the other, pro or con. That's how they have spreadsheets. Okay. I'm telling you, they have spreadsheets to track this stuff. So on any given month, it would be how many people, like they know this, the Minister of Health, the Prime Minister's office, the Minister of Public Safety has a report up that goes up maybe weekly or monthly or maybe even daily, depending on the politician, where it says, 50%, 80% of people called in saying we should decriminalize drugs, 20% said we shouldn't. Okay. This many on social media. So the lowest is social media. So you're sitting at home doing this all day. Maybe rethink if that's actually influencing. Just saying. Okay. I have actually started to do a bit more research on the impact of social media. I'm pretty active on it. I have to say I am taking about 80% of the time I was putting into social media engagement and putting into stuff like this, meeting with you folks and doing outreach and saying, hey, can I talk to your group? This, what we just did, has a far bigger impact than me spending an hour and a half clicking on social media. And I have a good following, and I've got a bit of a public profile. So think about for yourself too, those of you who've got, are on there and thinking, this is how I'm changing the world with your finger. Okay, do it, but pick up the phone, organize a meeting, meet with someone. And so, yeah, that's what I would just suggest. So, yeah, but again, it's not all about politicians. We want to change where society goes and the politicians follow. Remember Justin Trudeau's quote, he wants to keep his job. Your MP wants to keep their job. So if we start to shift that window of what's called the Overton window, it's the public policy options that are politically attractive and popular, that makes it so much easier. Then when you call them and say, we should do this, they go, what are other people saying? Yeah, okay, well, let's do it because I want to stay elected. So we've got a bigger piece than just talking to politicians.
Our last question, and then we will wrap up, is what are your thoughts around Bill 22, the discussion around involuntary treatment for youth and adults?
So generally speaking, I am the research and the people that I speak to have spoken to about this. We're quite adamant that involuntary treatment is not the way to go. And so you need to be ready for substance use treatment. You need to be ready for it. So much of it relates to your emotional state, your spiritual state, your psychological state. So to force someone in to do that, if forced treatment, by the way, means taking someone physically and using force, that's what force means. There's going to be someone with, restraint or, using force. And then it means going somewhere where you're going cold turkey, that's going to kill people. So that's not on. Things that are coerced treatment also are problematic. So things like drug court generally have big problems with that as well. Yeah, do some people begin to make a big shift in their life after facing a crisis? Yeah. Can it be a criminal justice or something else? Yeah, but it shouldn't be. Like, it doesn't have to be that. And so have I heard of people who stopped using, substances or used less substances because of some sort of intervention, like getting arrested? Yeah, but there's many, many, many more people who that actually made things worse. And by the way, there's access to drugs in prison, and it's just a lot worse. And there's a lot more violence involved, like horrific levels of violence, which I won't share on this call because we're not here to talk about that and not prepared to speak about that with you. But the most atrocious things I've heard in my life, and I've heard some pretty bad stuff in terms of the violence in prison around drug use. So this is not not on. And yeah. And I do think it's, again, part of this idea of blaming people. We just force people to stop. I mean, hey, wouldn't life be a lot easier? We just force people to stop doing things we didn't want. That's not how it works. And so this is where the care and compassion piece goes. So yeah, it's a lot of the whole thing around like decampments of homeless people, forced treatment. It's all the same hard-hearted approach. Right.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I just want to thank you so much for your presentation, for your insights. I feel personally it's really helpful to have the evidence because it doesn't come, as much as it is, and it comes from the heart and emotional place, it's also really good to have the evidence to back it up and to look at it through that lens. Before everybody takes off, because I know some people are leaving, just want you to know that we are going to be supporting Benjamin on his cross-country tour, like Mom Stop the Harm, in different cities across Canada. So we're in dialogue with Ben about that. So, and we're honored and pleased to do that. And so we will, watch for that in our social media things and our e-blasts and that kind of thing. And just watch for our other upcoming events for Mom Stop the Harm on our emails and social media. But I just really, truly want to thank you so much for all of your insight, for taking the time today and for doing this. And it's been so informative for all of us. So thank you. Thank you so much. And
thank you.
Yeah, big hearts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for all what you're doing and continue to do. I really appreciate the opportunity. Just encourage everyone here. I actually just posted the slides in the chat, so you can download those now. We keep the webinar open for a minute. People can download those, and yeah, wish you all the best. And if you are interested in helping us continue to spread this, this message of the need for a compassionate, evidence-based approach to this issue and others in our society, yeah, please get in touch with me through the website. I will get back to you, and I love doing talks like this. So if there's a group you're a part of, I'd be happy to come out again. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
You should be able to stop recording now.